Everyone told me to leave him. They didn't know about the grieving child he was quietly raising. I want to start with the version of this story my closest friends believed for the better part of a year. Because I believed it too, for longer than I'm proud of. In that version, my husband was a man with a secret he was too ashamed to name. He disappeared on weekend mornings without explanation. He took phone calls in the driveway, pacing, his voice low enough that I couldn't make out a single word through the kitchen window. He grew cagey, almost cold, whenever I asked him a direct question about where he'd been. Every woman in my life who loved me looked at that evidence and reached the same conclusion. And they reached it with the particular urgency people reserve for warning someone they love away from danger. They told me, one after another, over coffee, over the phone, in careful, worried voices, that I should leave him before I lost any more of myself to a marriage that had clearly already left me behind. Hello, my name is Claire, and this is the story of the year I very nearly listened to every person who loved me and walked away from the truest thing my husband had ever done. This isn't a story about an affair, though I understand completely why everyone around me, including me, was so certain it was. This is a story about a boy named Eli, a house across the street that went quiet far too suddenly, and a grief so large that my husband carried a piece of it in secret for almost a year, rather than risk losing the chance to carry it at all. I think you should understand, before I tell you about the year everything nearly fell apart, what kind of man I married. James and I had been together for 19 years by the time this story begins, married for 16 of them. He was not a man given to grand gestures. He showed his love the way steady people often do, in small, consistent acts nobody outside a marriage ever really sees. Remembering to warm my side of the bed on cold mornings, driving 40 minutes out of his way every single Sunday to bring bagels from the one bakery I liked best, sitting quietly beside me during the 3 difficult years we spent trying, unsuccessfully, to have children of our own, never once making me feel that my grief over that loss was something he expected me to manage alone. I want you to hold that picture of him firmly in your mind, because everything I'm about to tell you happened underneath it, and I think it matters that you understand exactly what kind of trust I was being asked to abandon. We had married in our late 20s, both of us drawn to each other, I think now, by a shared instinct for steadiness, an unspoken agreement that whatever life eventually asked of us, we would meet it without drama, without theatrics, simply by showing up for each other day after day. I remember our wedding as a small, quiet affair, no more than 40 guests, and I remember James's toast that evening, brief and understated in exactly the way he was, promising only that he would try, every day, to be the kind of steady he had rarely been given as a child, though at the time I did not fully understand what that phrase meant, or how much history it was quietly carrying. We lived, at the time this story starts, in a quiet cul-de-sac we'd chosen specifically for its stillness, the kind of street where everyone waves from their driveways and nobody locks their doors during the day. Across the street from us lived a woman named Renee, a single mother raising a 9-year-old son named Eli on her own, her husband long gone by the time they moved in. Out of the picture so completely that Eli rarely mentioned him at all. Renee worked long hours at a hospital pharmacy, and in the gaps left by her schedule, James, who coached the assistant position on Eli's school baseball team, had slowly, almost without either of us noticing, become something like a second steady adult in that boy's life. He taught Eli to throw a curveball in our backyard on Saturday afternoons. He fixed Eli's bicycle chain more times than either of us could count. I remember, in those early years, feeling nothing but warmth watching that friendship grow, grateful that a boy without a father in his life had found, by accident of geography, a man willing to fill in some of the gaps. I want to tell you about the day everything changed, because I think if I don't, you won't understand the size of what my husband decided to carry alone. It was an ordinary Tuesday in September, and I remember it precisely because I was in the middle of watering the porch plants when the ambulance pulled up across the street, lights spinning silently. No siren, which somehow felt worse than if there had been one. Renee had collapsed at work that morning, a sudden brain aneurysm the doctors would later explain in careful, gentle language that did nothing to soften the actual fact of it. She never regained consciousness. She was gone within 36 hours, and Eli, 9 years old, was left, in the space of 2 days, with no parent in the house across the street, no father anywhere in reach, and no family close enough to simply walk over and take him home. I watched James that week, in a way I hadn't watched him in years, because grief has a way of making people newly visible to each other. He went pale the moment we heard, and he was the first adult on that street to cross to Renee's house, the first to sit with Eli on the porch steps, while social workers and paramedics moved in and out of the front door behind them. I remember feeling proud of him that week, proud of the steadiness he offered a frightened, grieving child, while the rest of the neighborhood stood in stunned, well-meaning clusters on the sidewalk, unsure what to do with their own hands. I remember, too, the particular quiet that settled over our street in the days after Renee's death, the kind of quiet a neighborhood carries when it doesn't yet know how to grieve someone collectively. Casseroles appeared on the porch railing across the street, the way they always do, offerings from people who wanted to help but didn't know how. And I remember watching them accumulate, untouched, because there was no one left in that house steady enough to eat them, only a rotating cast of social workers and, for one devastating afternoon, Renee's own elderly mother, flown in briefly from out of state, overwhelmed and apologetic, explaining through tears that her own health simply would not allow her to take Eli home with her that week, or possibly for many weeks after that. What I did not understand, not for many months afterward, was that something in James broke open that week, something old and private that had nothing to do with Renee at all, and everything to do with a version of himself he had never fully told me about, even in 19 years together. Eli was placed, in the first chaotic weeks after his mother's death, into emergency foster care while the county tried to locate any relative willing and able to take him in. There was, eventually, a grandmother 2 states away, elderly and managing her own health problems, who agreed, in principle, to take custody, but the process of transferring guardianship across state lines, verifying her home, arranging the paperwork, took, in the end, far longer than anyone expected. 11 months, to be exact. 11 months during which a 9-year-old boy who had just lost his only parent lived in a temporary foster placement 2 towns over, attending a new school, sleeping in an unfamiliar room, waiting for a future that kept getting pushed further out of reach. I did not know, for most of those 11 months, that James was visiting him. I want to explain how the suspicion began, because I think it matters that you understand I did not invent my fear out of nothing. In the weeks after Eli was placed in foster care, James began disappearing on Saturday mornings, sometimes for 3 or 4 hours at a stretch, always vague about where he'd been, always slightly distracted for the rest of the day afterward. He started taking phone calls in the garage, door shut, voice low, calls that seemed to come from the same number every time, a number that was never saved in his phone under a name I recognized. I noticed, going through our bank statements one evening, several withdrawals I couldn't account for, always in cash, always around $50 or $60, occurring with a regularity that felt deliberate rather than incidental. And I noticed, most tellingly of all, that whenever I asked him directly where he'd been on those Saturday mornings, his answer came, a half-second too late, rehearsed in a way that 19 years of marriage had taught me to recognize instantly, even when I desperately wanted to believe otherwise. In other words, what began as a single, unexplained Saturday became, over the following months, a pattern I could no longer explain away as simple coincidence, and the timeline lined up, in my mind, with an unbearable neatness. Renee's death, and then, within weeks, a husband who had suddenly become someone I couldn't quite account for on weekend mornings. I did not go to my friends right away. For the first 2 months, I carried the suspicion alone, the way I think many of us do when we're not yet ready to give a fear a name in front of other people. Because naming it out loud makes it real in a way that private worry doesn't quite manage. But by the 3rd month, unable to hold it by myself any longer, I told my sister, and then my closest friend from college, and the reaction from both of them was immediate and unanimous. This was the unmistakable shape of an affair, and I needed to protect myself before it went any further. I want to be honest about how quickly that consensus solidified, because I think it says something important about how easily grief in a marriage can be misread as betrayal if nobody has the full picture. My sister pointed out that men going through a private crisis often act exactly this way: secretive, distracted, suddenly protective of their phones. My friend reminded me, gently but firmly, of a cousin of hers, whose husband's unexplained Saturday absences had turned out, eventually, to be a second apartment across town. Neither of them meant me any harm. They were doing what people who love you do when they see a pattern that has hurt someone else before. They were trying to spare me the slow, cumulative damage of staying too long in a situation everyone around me could see more clearly than I could, or so they believed. I want to tell you about the particular quality of that suspicion, because I think it's different from the suspicion that arrives all at once, in a single dramatic discovery. This was slower, more corrosive, built one small, unexplained detail at a time. I began noticing that James had started keeping his phone face down on the counter, a habit he'd never had before. I noticed him stepping outside to take calls even when I was nowhere near him, out of an abundance of caution that felt, at the time, like guilt rather than the discretion it actually was. I noticed that he had stopped mentioning Eli's name almost entirely, when in the years before Renee's death, he used to come home from practice full of small, funny stories about the boy's stubborn insistence on batting left-handed despite being naturally right-handed, or his elaborate theories about why the school cafeteria's pizza was secretly superior to any restaurant's. The silence around Eli's name, more than anything else, unsettled me, though I did not yet understand that James had stopped mentioning him not because the friendship had ended, but because it had grown into something he wasn't yet ready to explain. There is a particular Saturday, about 5 months into this pattern, that I still think about often. James had left that morning with his usual vague explanation, and I sat at our kitchen table with my sister on speakerphone, and she said, in the careful, loving voice of someone delivering difficult news, "Claire, I think you already know what this is. I think part of you has known for months. You deserve someone who doesn't make you feel like a detective in your own marriage." I remember agreeing with her, out loud, even as some quieter, more stubborn part of me resisted the shape of the story she was offering, because it didn't fully match the man I had spent 19 years learning the true rhythms of. James was not a man built for deception of that particular kind. But 5 months of unexplained Saturdays is a long time to hold on to an instinct against a mountain of circumstantial evidence, and by the end of that call, I had, for the first time, allowed myself to seriously consider the word my sister had been circling around for weeks: leave. There was another evening, closer to the 6th month, when James came home so exhausted he fell asleep on the couch before dinner, still in his coaching clothes, and I sat beside him for a long while, simply watching his face, searching it for some sign of the deception I had convinced myself was hiding there. What I saw instead, though I did not yet have the framework to understand it, was the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent his Saturday not with a mistress, but crouched on a dusty infield teaching a grieving 9-year-old how to keep his eye on a pitch even when his mind was somewhere else entirely, followed by an afternoon of paperwork nobody had told him he was required to fill out, simply because he had decided, on his own, that he wasn't going to let bureaucracy be the reason a child lost the one adult who had shown up consistently for him. I want to pause here and speak directly to anyone listening who has ever found themselves surrounded by well-meaning people confidently interpreting a mystery in your own life that they don't actually have full access to. Their concern is real. Their love for you is real. But concern, however sincere, is not the same thing as complete information, and I have learned, since, that the people around us can only ever advise us based on the shape of what they can see from the outside, which is not always the shape of the truth. The months went on, and the evidence, as I understood it then, only grew. I found, tucked into the inside pocket of his jacket one afternoon, a child's drawing, crayon on folded notebook paper, a stick figure baseball player beneath a scribbled sun, signed at the bottom in careful, uneven handwriting, "To Coach James, love Eli." I remember staring at that drawing for a long time, confused by the flood of relief and fresh confusion it brought all at once, because it didn't fit the story I had been building for months, and yet it didn't fully dissolve my suspicion either. I told myself James had simply kept a keepsake from before Renee's death, a small memento of a friendship that had since, in my mind, been overtaken by whatever was really happening on those Saturday mornings. I did not yet understand that the drawing was recent, made only weeks earlier, evidence of a friendship that had not ended with Renee's death at all, but had, in fact, deepened into something far larger than either of us could have anticipated. I found, too, a folder in the bottom drawer of his desk, locked, which was itself unusual, because James had never once in 19 years locked a drawer in our home. I did not force it open. I want to be honest that the thought crossed my mind more than once, in the darkest of those months, but something in me, some last thread of the trust I had built over 19 years, kept me from doing it, even as everyone around me insisted I had every right. The turning point, the moment everything I believed for those long months finally began to unravel into something entirely different, came on a rainy Saturday in April, 7 months after Renee's death. I had decided, that morning, after another vague explanation and another half-second hesitation in his voice, that I would finally follow him. I want to tell you honestly that I hated the person I felt myself becoming in that decision. A woman parked 2 cars behind her own husband on a residential street, heart pounding, prepared to have the worst suspicion of her marriage confirmed. I followed him across town, past the school where Eli used to attend before the move, out toward the quieter side streets near the county's temporary foster placement office, and I watched him pull into the parking lot of a modest group home, a converted 2-story house with a wheelchair ramp out front and a faded sign near the door. He did not go in to meet a woman. He went in, I would soon learn, to pick up a grieving 9-year-old boy for their standing Saturday morning ritual, batting practice at the same field where James still coached, followed by lunch at the same diner they'd been visiting together since long before Renee's death, a ritual James had fought, quietly and persistently, to be allowed to continue even after Eli was moved into county care, because he understood, better than almost anyone around that boy, how much a single unbroken piece of routine can mean to a child whose entire world has otherwise been upended. I sat in my car in the rain outside that group home for a long time after he came back out with Eli beside him, watching the 2 of them through the windshield, Eli's face lighting up in a way I hadn't seen since before Renee's death, James crouching down to help him with his jacket zipper the way he must have done 100 times before. I did not yet understand the full shape of what I was looking at, but some old, tired part of me already knew that whatever this was, it wasn't the thing I had spent 7 months bracing myself for. I did not confront him that day. I drove home ahead of him, and when he returned that evening, tired in the particular way I now understood came from an entire day spent caring for someone else's grief on top of his own, I said nothing, though something in me had already begun, quietly, to shift. I want to tell you about the weeks that followed, because I think they matter as much as the discovery itself. I began paying closer attention, not through following him again, but through the small, careful noticing that becomes possible once suspicion starts to loosen its grip enough to let curiosity back in. I found, in the same jacket pocket where I'd once found the crayon drawing, a folded permission slip from Eli's temporary school, listing James, not as a parent, but under a line reserved for approved visitor. his signature beside it, dated months earlier, long before that rainy April Saturday. I understood, seeing that whatever James had been doing, he had been doing it through proper channels, quietly navigating a bureaucracy most people never have to learn the shape of, simply to remain present in a grieving child's life. The locked drawer, when he finally opened it for me, held not evidence of an affair, but an entire paper trail of James's private effort over those 11 months, correspondence with the county foster care office, a half-finished application for kinship-adjacent guardianship status that he had researched and begun completing on his own, receipts for cleats and a new glove and a winter coat Eli had needed, and, tucked at the very back, a single page, handwritten, that I would not fully understand the significance of until he explained it to me himself, weeks later, at our own kitchen table. That explanation came on a Tuesday evening in May, almost exactly 8 months after Renee's death, when James finally sat me down, his hands trembling slightly, the locked drawer's contents spread carefully between us, and told me the truth he had been carrying alone since the week of that first ambulance. He told me about his own childhood, a part of his history he had shared with me only in careful, minimal fragments over 19 years of marriage, never in the full detail he offered me that night. He described the day his mother died, with a specificity that told me he had never once let himself forget a single detail of it, not in over 40 years. He was 8, and she had been sick for a long time before that, though as a child he hadn't understood the word terminal, or what it meant for a house to slowly go quiet the way ours had gone, quiet across the street from Renee's. He remembered the exact shade of yellow in the hospital room curtains, the particular sound of his father's voice on the phone in the hallway outside, low and controlled in a way that frightened him more than crying would have. He remembered, most of all, the days immediately afterward, when a rotating cast of relatives and neighbors brought food and spoke to him in the same careful, overly gentle tone adults use with children they don't quite know how to comfort, and how none of it had actually made him feel less alone, because what he needed, he told me, wasn't casseroles or careful tones. It was one single adult willing to simply stay, consistently, without flinching away from his grief, once the first difficult weeks had passed and everyone else's attention had moved on to their own lives again. His father, he said, had tried in his own limited way, but grief had hollowed him out completely, and within a year, unable to manage both his own devastation and a young son's needs, he had made the decision to place James in foster care, believing, perhaps sincerely, that James would be better cared for by people equipped to handle a grieving child. James told me he understood, as an adult, the impossible position his father had been in. But as an 8-year-old, all he understood was that he had lost his mother, and then, within a year, lost his father too, in every way that mattered, and he had spent the following 4 years being moved between homes that were, by no fault of the families involved, never quite steady enough to convince him he was allowed to stop bracing for the next departure. He told me about the 4th home, the one that finally stuck, a couple named the Halversons who took him in at 12, and never once in all the years after treated his grief as an inconvenience or a problem requiring a schedule. He said Mrs. Halverson used to sit with him on the porch some evenings, not talking, just sitting, letting him be as sad or as silent as he needed to be, for as long as he needed to be it, and that single, unglamorous act of simply staying had done more to heal him than every well-meaning casserole and careful tone from all the years before it combined. He said that watching Eli, in the days after Renee's death, surrounded by kind people who nonetheless would all eventually move on with their own lives, he recognized, with a clarity that frightened him, exactly what that boy was about to lose if nobody chose, deliberately, to become his own version of a porch-sitting Mrs. Halverson. His mother had died when he was 8 years old, and his father, unable or unwilling to cope, had placed him in the foster system, where James spent the following 4 years moving between 5 different homes before finally landing, at 12, with a family who kept him through the rest of his childhood. He told me that the hardest part of those years had never been the grief of losing his mother, but the specific, compounding loneliness of watching every well-meaning adult around him treat his grief as something to be managed and processed on a schedule, rather than something a child needed a steady, consistent presence to simply sit inside of for as long as it took. He said that the moment he learned Eli had no father in reach and no mother left at all, something in him that had been quiet for over 40 years woke up entirely, and he made a private decision, in the parking lot of that group home during his very first visit, that he would not let this particular child experience the specific loneliness he himself had never fully recovered from. He did not tell me, he said, because he was ashamed of the effort itself, but because he was terrified, from the very beginning, of 2 things at once: that the guardianship process might fail, leaving him to explain to me a loss and a grief that had never fully belonged to either of us, and that if he told me too soon, before he understood whether it was even possible, I might see it as an impossible ask, given everything we had already been through trying to build our own family. He told me, and I have thought about this sentence every day since, "I was so afraid you'd say it was too much, that we'd already grieved enough trying to have a child of our own, and I didn't want to make you carry that fear on top of everything else. I thought if I could just get far enough into the process alone, I could bring it to you as something almost finished, instead of another loss for you to worry about." He told me, too, about the specific bureaucratic maze he had spent those 8 months quietly learning to navigate, a maze I had never once glimpsed the shape of from the outside. Because he was not a blood relative, and because the county's priority was always to place Eli with kin whenever possible, James had no automatic standing to remain involved in the boy's life at all once the emergency placement began. He told me about the first meeting he'd had with the caseworker, a brisk, overworked woman named Ms. Alvarez, who had explained to him, not unkindly, that approved visitor status required background checks, references, and a formal application most casual family friends never bothered pursuing, precisely because most casual family friends assumed, understandably, that their role in a child's life would simply end once the immediate crisis passed. James told me he had sat in that office and thought of Mrs. Halverson's porch, and he had filled out every form Ms. Alvarez handed him without hesitation, driven by an urgency he didn't yet know how to explain to himself, let alone to me. He described the Saturday mornings themselves in more detail than I had let myself imagine while I was busy constructing an entirely different story out of them. He would arrive at the group home at 9, sign Eli out under the terms of his approved visitor status, and they would drive to the same field where James had once taught him to throw a curveball in our own backyard. He said the batting practice itself mattered less than the ritual of it, the simple, unbroken continuity of doing the same thing, in the same order, at the same hour, week after week, because Eli, in the wreckage of losing everything else familiar, had told him once, quietly, between pitches, that the only thing that made the weeks bearable was knowing exactly what Saturday would look like before it arrived. Lunch afterward, always at the same diner, always the same booth by the window, always the same order, a grilled cheese with the crusts cut off, though Eli was 9 and old enough, technically, to eat his crusts, a small, stubborn ritual from before his mother's death, but James had never once suggested he outgrow. I asked him, that night, the question that had been sitting beneath all my other questions for 8 months. I asked him why he hadn't simply trusted me with the truth from the very beginning, rather than let the people who loved me build an entirely different story out of his silence. He said that shame, once it takes root in a person early enough, doesn't announce itself as shame. It disguises itself as protection, as consideration, as a private effort to spare the people you love from a burden you've convinced yourself is yours alone to carry. He said he understood, hearing about my sister's advice, about the growing chorus of people telling me to leave him, exactly how close his silence had come to costing him the one thing he had never once, in 19 years, actually been willing to risk losing. I sat with him at that kitchen table for a long time after he finished speaking. The paperwork from the locked drawer still spread carefully between us, and I found myself reaching for his hand the way I imagine Mrs. Halverson must have once rested a hand on his shoulder on that quiet porch decades earlier, when nobody else had known how to sit with him in his grief without flinching away from it. I thought about the 8 months I had spent constructing an entirely different story out of his silence, and I felt, alongside the tenderness, a quiet grief of my own, for all the evenings I might have spent helping him carry this, instead of unknowingly adding to the weight of it with my own growing suspicion. I want to tell you what happened after that conversation, because I believe the ending matters every bit as much as the 8 months of silent suspicion that came before it. I did not leave him. I felt, instead, an overwhelming tenderness for the 8-year-old boy he had once been, moved between 5 different homes without a single adult fighting to keep his grief steady, and for the man he had become, quietly determined to make sure no child within his reach would ever have to know that particular loneliness again. I understood, finally, that the drawer he had locked for the first time in 19 years of marriage had never held anything but love, guarded so carefully because he did not yet trust that our marriage could hold both his old wound and his new hope for Eli, without one somehow threatening the other. The following Saturday, I asked to come with him. He looked at me across the kitchen for a long moment, and something in his face loosened in a way I hadn't seen in all our years together. He said, quietly, "I'd like that. I think it's time you two finally met properly." I told my sister about all of this in the days before I met Eli, wanting her to hear the full truth from me before she heard any second-hand version of it, and I remember the long silence on the other end of the phone once I finished, followed by the sound of her crying. The particular crying of someone recalibrating an entire narrative they'd been certain about for months. She told me she wished, more than anything, that she had asked more questions before offering such confident advice, and I told her, honestly, that I understood completely why she hadn't. The evidence, from the outside, had never once suggested anything but betrayal. Grief and guilt, I was learning, wear almost identical disguises when they're carried in secret, and only the person carrying them ever really knows which one it actually is. I met Eli that Saturday morning at the same baseball field where James had spent the better part of a year teaching him to throw a curveball. He was shy at first, the particular shyness of a child who has learned, the hard way, that new adults sometimes disappear from his life without warning. But he warmed slowly over the course of the morning, showing me his batting stance with a seriousness that made James laugh in a way I hadn't heard from him in months. Afterward, over lunch at the diner they'd been visiting together since before Renee's death, Eli asked me with the particular bluntness of a 9-year-old whether I was going to be around for a while too, or whether I was one of the grown-ups who came and went. I told him I was planning on sticking around for a long time, and I watched something in his small shoulders relax that I hadn't even realized was tensed. He ordered his grilled cheese, crusts cut off, and I watched James lean over and cut them himself before the waitress even had the chance. An automatic, practiced gesture, built from months of Saturdays I hadn't known about. I remember feeling, in that small moment, the full weight of everything I had missed by not being there sooner, not out of any fault of James's, but simply because I hadn't yet been let into the room where this particular love had been quietly growing. I found myself asking Eli questions about his mother, gently, unsure whether the subject was still too raw, and he answered easily, telling me she used to sing very badly in the car and never cared who heard her, a detail that made all 3 of us laugh so hard. The woman in the next booth turned to smile at us. I understood, in that laughter, that grief and joy are not opposites in a child's life, the way adults sometimes assume they are. They simply learn to sit beside each other, the way Eli's sadness and his easy laughter sat beside each other that whole afternoon. Both equally real, both equally his to carry. The guardianship process, once James finally brought me fully into it, moved differently than it had when he was navigating it alone. Together, we made the case, formally, to become Eli's legal foster parents while his grandmother's own transfer continued its slow progress. And in the months that followed, when her health made it clear she would not, after all, be able to take on the daily demands of raising a 9-year-old, we made the decision, together, to pursue permanent guardianship instead. I remember signing those papers beside James, thinking about the version of myself who had sat on the phone with my sister 8 months earlier, seriously considering the word leave, and feeling a grief for that frightened woman alongside an enormous gratitude that some small, stubborn part of her had refused to act on the fear entirely. I remember, too, the day Ms. Alvarez, the caseworker who had once handed James a stack of approved visitor paperwork in a brisk, businesslike tone, came to our home for what would be the final home visit before the guardianship was finalized. She sat at our kitchen table, the same table where James had finally told me everything months earlier, and she told us, with a warmth I hadn't expected from our earlier secondhand impression of her, that in 15 years of this work, she had rarely seen an approved visitor pursue the process as thoroughly or as patiently as James had, entirely on his own, months before there was any guarantee it would lead anywhere at all. She said most people, understandably, waited for certainty before committing that much of themselves. She said James had never once waited for certainty. He had simply kept showing up, week after week, letting the certainty catch up to him eventually. The same way, I realized, he had shown up for me for 19 years, steady long before either of us had any guarantee of where it would lead. I want to tell my sister's reaction here because I think it matters. When I finally told her the whole story, she was quiet for a long time on the phone, and then she said, "I am so sorry I was so sure. I only ever wanted to protect you." I told her I understood completely, because from where she was standing, with only the evidence I had given her, she had reached the only reasonable conclusion available, that is, I think, the particular danger of a well-intentioned chorus of advice. It is only ever as accurate as the information it's built on, and grief, when it hides itself out of shame rather than deceit, gives almost no honest information to work with at all. I think about those 8 months often now. I think about all the ways I nearly let a chorus of loving, well-meaning voices talk me out of the truest thing my husband had ever quietly done. And I want to say clearly, for anyone listening who is currently surrounded by people telling them to leave, based on a pattern that looks, from the outside, exactly like betrayal, not every secretive silence is a wound waiting to happen. Sometimes it is shame, wearing the disguise of protection, wrapped around a grief or a hope so large the person carrying it does not yet trust anyone, even the people who love them most, to help hold it steady. That does not mean my own fear, across those 8 months, was foolish or unearned. I want to be honest about that too. Unexplained absences, a locked drawer, a half-second hesitation in his voice. These are not small things. And a woman who notices them and grows afraid is not a woman failing at trust. She is a woman paying attention to her own life, and she deserves an honest answer far sooner than 8 months of silence ever gave me. I think about those 8 months often now. For anyone listening who is currently surrounded by people telling them to leave, based on a pattern that looks, wrapped around a grief or a hope so large the person carrying it does not yet waiting to happen. Sometimes it is shame, wearing the disguise of protection, wrapped around a grief or a hope so large the person carrying it does not yet waiting to happen. I do not say this to suggest that grief always resolves itself so neatly, because I know, deeply, that it often does not. I say it only because I think it matters, for anyone listening who is still waiting for their own version of an answer. that sometimes the family we are meant to build looks nothing at all like the one we spent years quietly planning for. If I could go back, I would not tell myself to dismiss my instincts, or to ignore the people who loved me and were only trying to protect me. I would tell my younger self, and James's younger self too, that shame cannot be outrun through silence, only through the harder, more vulnerable act of saying the frightening thing out loud before the silence itself becomes the greater danger. But I would also tell myself this, and I offer it now to anyone listening who is standing, tonight, in the particular loneliness of being surrounded by advice that doesn't quite match the quiet, stubborn instinct in your own chest. Know your worth enough to ask for the truth directly, rather than building an entire private mythology out of half-seen fragments, however painful the question feels to voice out loud. Understand that the advice of people who love you, however sincere, is only ever built from what they can see, and what they can see is never the whole picture. This is not an argument for ignoring the people who love you, nor a suggestion that every unexplained absence in a marriage is secretly a hidden good deed waiting to be discovered. It is only an argument for staying curious a little longer, for asking one more direct question before accepting the most painful available explanation as the only one. Trust their love. Question their certainty when it doesn't match the deeper truth you already sense about the person you've chosen to build a life with. Remember that grief and shame can look identical to betrayal from the outside, especially when they wear the same disguise of secrecy and unexplained absence. Compassion for someone's hidden grief does not mean excusing every silence indefinitely. It means staying curious a little longer before assuming the very worst. Recognize, too, that a person who was once a grieving child themselves often carries an invisible radar for other children in that same particular kind of pain, and that radar can pull them toward an act of quiet devotion long before they've found the words to explain it to the people closest to them. James did not choose Eli by accident. Some old, unhealed part of the 8-year-old boy he had once been recognized. Instantly and completely, the 9-year-old boy across the street who was about to be handed the same lonely road James had once walked alone, and something in him simply refused to let that happen twice. Learn, too, that some of the deepest acts of love a person can offer are the ones they are most afraid to name out loud, precisely because naming them makes the possibility of losing them unbearably real. James's silence was never about deceiving me. It was about protecting a fragile hope he did not yet trust himself to survive losing in front of me. And believe, finally, that the truth behind the pattern you've spent months quietly fearing is rarely the monster everyone around you has confidently assumed it to be. Far more often, if you stay curious long enough to ask, what you'll find on the other side of that silence is not an ending at all, but a beginning. Someone was simply too frightened and too full of old, unhealed grief of their own to introduce you to any sooner. I think, too, about the version of this story I might be telling you if I had listened to my sister 8 months earlier, if I had walked away from James before that rainy April Saturday ever gave me the chance to follow him to the truth instead of away from it. I think about Eli, in that alternate version, losing not only his mother, but the one steady adult who had promised, without ever saying so in words, that he would not disappear the way so many other adults in his young life already had. I do not know what would have happened to that boy in a version of this story where I trusted my fear more than my 19 years of evidence about the kind of man James actually was. I am simply grateful, every single day, that I never had to find out. Eli is 14 now, and he calls me Mom on the days it feels right to him, and Claire on the days it doesn't. And I have learned to let both be exactly enough. He still plays baseball, though he's grown taller than James now, a fact James brings up with a pride that makes my chest ache every single time. I think, often, about that rainy April Saturday, parked outside a group home 2 towns over, prepared to have my very worst fear confirmed. And I am endlessly grateful that the truth, waiting for me there, was never the ending, everyone predicted, but the quiet, unglamorous beginning of the family we were always, somehow, meant to become. There's a photograph on our refrigerator now, taken the day the guardianship was finalized. The three of us standing on the courthouse steps, Eli grinning in a way that still catches in my throat every time I pass it. Beside it, tucked under a magnet, is the crayon drawing I once found in James's jacket pocket. The stick figure baseball player beneath its scribbled sun. The first piece of evidence I ever misread so completely. I kept it, in the end, not as a reminder of the months I spent afraid, but as a reminder of how close love can sometimes look to secrecy before you're finally given the whole picture, and how grateful I am, every single day, that I stayed long enough to be given mine. If this story brought some value to your life, please consider clicking like. It is the only way we know this content was truly meaningful to you.